All right, so I am now going to introduce our speaker. I'm really excited and looking forward to her presentation. Susan Brower is the Minnesota State Demographer and directs the Minnesota State Demographic Center. She became the state demographer in February 2012. In that capacity, she travels the state talking with Minnesotans about the new social and economic realities that are brought about by recent demographic shifts, and we all know about that throughout the Midwest. Susan's work applies an understanding of demographic trends to changes in a range of areas, including the state's economy and workforce, education, health, immigration, and rural and population changes. She joined the State Demographic Center after working as a researcher on the Minnesota Compass Project at Wilder Research in St. Paul. That's a nonprofit here we love. Prior to that, she worked at the Population Studies Center at the University of Michigan. I'm in front of the Michigan table, if you know that. Yeah. Susan earned her PhD in sociology at the University of Michigan, specializing in demography and family sociology. She also holds a master's degree in public policy from the Humphrey, that's in Minnesota, School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Let's give a round of applause for Susan as I look forward to her presentation. And she has a great name.
Hello, everyone. It's good to see you all. That was a warm welcome. Thank you. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about our office and about how I got to be doing what I'm doing now, and then I'll jump into the data that I have for you. So we're a small office in state government. There are 5 of us currently. 4 of us are demographers, 1's a program person, and we are not appointed by the governor. We're just here doing our demographics for nonprofits, government agencies, both state government, local government. We make projections about the future, and I'll share some of that with you tonight. And then we do a lot of analysis, helping people understand what demographic trends mean for them. And so one of the reason that I got interested in demographics, it wasn't until I was 30 years old that I even knew that was a thing you could study or a thing that people did. When I was in policy school at the University of Minnesota here, I had a demographics class, and I was just so intrigued by how easily you could see the future with these demographic trends. And so I thought, well, that's a useful thing to do. I can study that, and I can help people kind of understand what's coming. And so that's what I intend to share with you tonight, some of the things that I think will impact higher ed in the Midwest in the coming years. I don't know exactly how these things will play out. I have some ideas, but I hope it will start a discussion, and I'm leaving plenty of time for us to ask questions or to discuss at the end of my presentation here. So with that, I'm going to jump in and show you what I know about the demographic trends that are shaping our communities, our states, our institutions, our places of employment. And I'll let you know what I think they mean, but I certainly want to hear from you as well to hear what you think the implications might mean. I'll say one more thing about demographics, why I am interested in it, and that is that for the most part, it's pretty inevitable. The way that demographics are going to go are the way that they're going to go, and we cannot do a whole lot to change any of the trends that are already set in motion. They're bigger than any of us. And so kind of my message to most folks as you're looking at some of these numbers and understanding what's coming and what's unfolding is both to kind of take in the inevitability of this, but also kind of consider how we align with the trends as they unfold. That's my best advice, is not to fight some of these things. So I'll start just kind of with some level setting, what we know from some of the census data, and then I'll get into some of the more nuts and bolts demographic. So we know that educational attainment, of course, has been increasing over time. It's continuing to increase. These are percentages. I'm standing too close to something, I'm afraid, here. These are percentages for young people ages 25 to 29, so it gives you this nice tight picture of what's happening with the youngest cohort, that they're continuing to increase in terms of their attainment. This is BA or higher. And then if we look at the range of states, we see quite a difference state by state, but generally kind of all in the same ballpark. All have been kind of moving in the same direction over time if we look at it state by state. One of the biggest demographic trends, this will not be a surprise to you, but I want you to kind of understand the scale and the timing of this, is that we're continuing in the Midwest, and for our states, almost entirely all the Midwestern states have seen declining number of births over time. And this just gives you a sense of how many births we're talking about, how much difference we're talking about. From 2007, there were about 900,000 births. 2022, just under 750,000. And so if you think about this in terms of what it might mean for enrollments, you know, these year after year declines are cumulative. And so we're really, year over year, having a considerable impact on post-secondary school enrollment if you think about what this declining birth rate means. Sometimes people will ask me, well, is this going to turn around? What do we think? This is one of those things, it's bigger than any of us. If you think about the generation that is, say, your grandparents' generation, and think about how many brothers and sisters they had, what was kind of an average family size at the time. Can you imagine your families on average going back to that size, or all of our families in the community going back to that size? No, see? Think about the 20-somethings in your lives, or the 30-somethings in your lives, or maybe you are a 20 or 30-something. Think about someone telling you, you know what, we need to increase the birth rate because this is causing a lot of systems change, institutional change. They're going to say, I don't care. I'm not having 7 children. Of course, there are people who still have very large families and cultures sometimes that have preferences for larger families, but when we're talking about averages, we're talking about which direction this is moving. We expect these rates to continue to decline over time into the foreseeable future. There may be little blips here and there due to economics or due less so to policy. In general, these demographic trends have kind of left the building. They're already continuing to decline over time. They'll continue to do so. In nearly every state represented here, we've seen declines over this time period. And I don't know is North Dakota mostly over here, except for North Dakota. Woo-woo! And I'll say that this is not because necessarily like the fertility rate change or the birth rate change. This is just because there's been such a shift in migration over this time period. So you have oil, right? Exactly. You have so many more people moving in. Well, we have that too. We have cold winters too. So North Dakota kind of stands out, but in general, that's due to the flow of people in because of the oil, because of the kind of new inflows that you've seen over the last 10 to 15 years. And that's why the birth rate has gone up, because there's more parents, not because people want to have larger families or something. But otherwise, you can see, you know, these are averages over the 15-year period. This is a considerable decline. And we don't expect this to turn. I mean, these are the folks who are headed into post-secondary school in the next 10 years, right? We don't expect to see that turn around anytime soon. Then if we look kind of at where young people are coming from, so not just the number, but where are they coming from in terms of their economic circumstances, I think this is kind of a good number to keep in mind, just to think about the situation of young people who are considering whether post-secondary school is possible for them. And I'm showing you here a statistics that is the 200% of the federal poverty threshold, so it's pretty much double what you would have in terms of the poverty line. And I'm sharing that number. It's not just random. It's a pretty good approximation of what we think it takes to cover basic living expenses. So we have a cost of living calculator here in the state of Minnesota. You plug in the numbers. If you look at the poverty line and then double it, that's about what it takes to cover things like childcare, food, housing, clothing. No extra savings, no entertainment. This is about kind of what we're talking about, just meeting basic costs. And so I think it's important to kind of consider that about 30% of, I have 16 and 17-year-olds, are in a situation in which their families are covering basic expenses, but probably no more. And so the thought that we can save enough as young families with children, that's going to probably not be possible for a large share of families. So we can tell people to save, but there's a large share that are going to be in that situation where it's not going to be possible. And then I just shared those numbers with you state by state so you can have a sense what that looks like in your particular state, what share of 16 and 17-year-olds are living in those situations. I don't have, one of the things I like about my job is I display the problem unto you, and the policy is yours to run with. I don't know that I like that, but I hope this is useful information for you. I don't have, what should we do then? Okay. Another important kind of demographic dimension that fits with enrollments going into the future is just what does the college high school graduation rate look like? And we've actually seen that increase over time by about 1% a year. So you may recall what we just looked at in terms of the percentage of births declining year over year. This is increasing, so it's countering it to some degree, but it's really going to depend on your particular state whether the increasing high school graduation rates are truly countering the declining birth rates and whether they can do so into the foreseeable future. We know those birth rates are going to continue to move in the one direction. And for some states that have already very, very high high school graduation rates, there's really only so much room to improve at that point. It's a good thing. I know this is impossible to read, so I'm just going to generally give you a sense of this. I apologize, especially you folks back there. I'm giving you state by state differences between high school graduation for Black students on the left, those are the circles on the left, and white students on the right. And so you can see at the bottom, some of the states represented in this room have the largest gaps, Black-white gaps in high school graduation rates. Many of the Midwest, they're represented across the board, but tend to be, some congregated there in the bottom. And generally, I just want you to see those numbers and see that difference as kind of that opportunity space for where there's room for improvement. If we see Hispanic or Latino gaps, we see some of those same differences as well. So this is just one example of how high school graduation rates have to work together with some of those birth rates, declining birth rates over time. Okay, this is another demographic trend that we know is moving in one direction and will continue to move in one direction, and that's toward the increased diversity of our states and of our country. We're looking here at young people of color, or BIPOC, young adults, 18 to 21 years old, and this is just the percentage that reported on their census form or their survey that they were people of color or belonged to a Black, Indigenous, or population of color, including Hispanic or Latino, Asian, American Indian, Black or African American. I think sometimes when people are thinking about the diversity of our country, the diversity, especially of the Midwest, they think, well, this is being fueled by people moving in. And because, people put stories together, that's just how we work. We want to make a story and make sense for why this is changing. But what I'll say in terms of the diversity, at least in Minnesota, and I suspect it's true for many other states, is that it is growing from its own momentum of people who are already living here in Minnesota, already living in the Midwest, because we have many more diverse young people than we have older people. As those young people move into the parenting ages, they have more diverse babies, and then that bottom kind of base of the population pyramid gets more diverse as well. So I want you to kind of think of this increasing diversity of our state or of our region as really something that is cooked into our age structure. It's something that will continue to play out. It's something that's been put in motion that may be affected by migration, either from other parts of the US or other parts of the globe, but certainly our state here in Minnesota, and I would suspect many of yours, would continue to get more diverse regardless of what happens with international immigration. Here's just a snapshot. I wanted to give each of you a picture of what your state looks like relative to the trend we were just looking at. So you can see there's some difference between 18% and 50% of the states represented in this room. And then finally, kind of a last point on the diversity of students and their kind of economic situations. If we look at all people who are 16 and 17 years old, so just set to move on to post-secondary school potentially, just because there are so many more white, non-Hispanic young people in the Midwest, we have kind of a larger proportion of people who are lower income, those numbers that we were just looking at. I know that we have much higher rates, and you all know that we have much higher rates of low income and poverty among populations of color, but just in terms of the sheer numbers, this is what it looks like in terms of the number of potential students who are in that pool. Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit for this last section of my presentation here, and I want to talk a little bit more about workforce and what we expect with respect to employment and labor force growth and demand for workers. And because I think it's going to be an important context for how higher ed operates in the future, and it probably already is impacting student enrollment and kind of the choice whether or not to go on to post-secondary school. So this is a population pyramid for Minnesota. If you're very interested, I can show you your own state at another, you just email me, I'll send you your population pyramid, but I'll say for almost every state here, you get this little bend in at the bottom, and that's the youngest and cutest residents of your state, most certainly. But that's what we were just talking about in terms of fewer and fewer births. But what's really impacting our workplaces right now and will begin to impact higher ed, post-secondary school, is the retirement of the baby boomers who are just set to move above that 65-year-old age mark. So if you think of this graph like it's an escalator, and every year one of these bars moves up, every year another bar moves up an age group, you kind of get the sense for where we are in terms of the number of retirements. And the point here, especially in Minnesota and for many of your states, is that the baby boom generation have not yet fully retired, and so there are more retirements to come in the next 10 years. We're partway through this transition, but there's more time to come. If we lay out kind of where the baby boomers are in their lifetime, it gives us some sense for some of the institutional and community changes that we are all experiencing. And we know that the first baby boomer turned age 65 in 2011. We started feeling workforce shortages somewhere before 2020, before the pandemic. Everything got turned upside down during the pandemic, but we're continuing to feel workforce shortages after that. But we still have a good number of years where there will be more retirements. Then if we look kind of longer term and think about the baby boomers moving into their older ages, that gives us a sense of the timing of the transitions as it impacts healthcare and the costs associated with healthcare and public budgets that need to align with the costs associated with healthcare. And so I think that also impacts post-secondary education in that those costs will be coming. We know, generally, we all know we're aging. Generally, we all know it's because of the baby boomers and because of lower birth rates. But this gives you a little bit clearer sense, I hope, of when some of these impacts will happen, why they're happening, when they're happening, and what we can look forward to in the coming years. Because we have so many baby boomers who have been retiring and our birth rates have been low, we've had a flattened growth, or not any growth, I should say. No growth, no decline, actually a little bit of a decline for the Midwest overall, in the number of people who are 16 to 64, or the number of people who are likely to be out and working. And so while we have seen growth year over year in the 90s and the 2000s, we really have started to kind of reach a peak where the workforce, at least this is true. It's not true for you, North Dakota. This is not your issue. But probably everyone else in the room is experiencing this level off of workforce growth. And into the future, we're expecting, at least here in Minnesota, we're expecting to see that just remain flat into the foreseeable future. It's no longer fueled by births. The baby boomers are retiring out of these years, or moving out of these years. And so what we have is this economy that wants more workers, and we have no people to fill the jobs that are there. And that's something that's really bigger than kind of anyone's preference. It's background stuff that we don't necessarily pay attention to, but I think it has important implications for post-secondary ed and what students choose to do, because the offerings that are available to them are different because there are fewer workers. This is showing you the Midwest. We've looked at the number of people so far. Now let's just look at the number of jobs that are available, that are open in the Midwest. And so this blue section represents the number of job vacancies in any month from 2000 to 2023. And you can see that kind of bumping along. During the Great Recession, it declined, and this here is showing you the number of unemployed, or people who are actively looking for work. And what was important before the Great Recession is that we had more jobs than we had people who are actively looking for work. That spiked around the pandemic, and so there was much, much more employment. But what we have seen since that time is ongoing growth in job vacancies and very, very few people who are unemployed or looking for work. So you pair that together, this picture together, with the fact that we don't project much more growth, not you, North Dakota, but we don't project much more growth going forward because our birth rates are low. We don't have a whole lot of migration. It means that this tight labor market and the pull into work and employers' willingness to both train and take in workers who may not quite be ready to do exactly what job they may have, these things are all starting to align, I think, in part because of these demographic and economic conditions. Our states, this is the Midwest again, already have very high labor force participation, both of men and women. So there's not a lot of room there to say, hey, let's bring a whole lot more people. Let's figure out how to make it work for a whole lot more people. Because we already have high rates. Maybe we can do that a little bit, but that's not going to be the solution. The solution is really bigger than that. And then in terms of immigration, if we look at, maybe immigration can help us out with this growth. Maybe that can be something that can supplement some of the lack of growth that we've had in the past. Well, if we look at domestic migration, these are the bars year over year since 2011, you can see that the Midwestern states tend to lose on net more people than they gain. We are a net exporter of people out into the world, so that's part of why our numbers are remaining low. And that our international numbers are not fully compensating for those domestic losses at this point. So migration is helping us a little bit. We're getting some people added to our states because of international immigration. But if you look at kind of all the losses that we have or the gains due to international immigration, it's not enough to fully counter in any one year. Another eye test, I'm sorry, but I want to just give you the point that across the board, there are a lot of job openings. Many of them tend to be in lower skilled fields that don't necessarily have a career trajectory. And that's another important place for post-secondary education to step in and be loud about the contribution, that not all jobs are equal, that there's a whole lot of jobs out there. But there are a fair number of jobs that are also requiring all kinds of education. So the healthcare practitioners and technical occupations are in there. These are numbers for Minnesota alone, 18,000 openings in the most recent period. Many of these across the board require higher level skills and education. And so with that, did I make you all tired? I'm so sorry. I tend to have that effect on, I do have to tell you this, sometimes, especially when I'm showing you the workforce shortage numbers to employers, they're like, I can see the realization come across their face that this is not over and that indeed it's probably going to get kind of worse for some people in the coming years, and they just want to put their heads down on the table and take a little less. But when I share these numbers with young people, they think, this might not be so bad for me. And certainly it does mean more opportunity for the folks that you are all working hard to educate, for people who are just entering the workforce, for people who haven't found kind of full and productive work for whatever reason, whatever their life circumstances. And so this is a lot of takeaways, but I'll just quickly tell you, as I said, birth rates are going to continue to decline. It will be our job to align with that, for post-secondary school to align with that. The high school graduation rates, they might increase a little bit more. They'll partially counter what we see, but perhaps not for the long term, that those birth rates will continue to decline. There's ongoing barriers to college. I don't need to tell you this, to attending college. But with the slower labor force growth and the worker shortage, I think that this is probably something that maybe we need to take some time to consider what that means for higher ed, and how do we align with that new reality if it's an ongoing pull of people away from post-secondary school and directly into the workforce. And so I know those are issues that you've dealt with in the past, but I'm here to tell you, as far as I can tell, I think that's an issue that's probably going to stay and be exacerbated in the future. And so with that, do you have any questions for me or comments? Something that you saw? Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit more about domestic migration?
Sure.
The coast have been where it's at. We're a flyover country, but there's more talk about cost of living being a benefit in the Midwest.
Yep.
The Midwest being a climate refuge, things like that. Any 3, 5, 10 years down the road, do you see any aberrations from what has happened?
So migration trends change very, very slowly. People tend to move short distances, not long distances. They don't necessarily pick up and move unless they've got a very specific reason, a job, a college. And so it's hard to shift these in any given year, which means they're very stable to read. But what I will say is that in the US, most of the flows of migrants have been going to the southern states, in particular Texas, Florida, Nevada, Utah, the southwestern states, Arizona, and those are states that have the largest tax on the water system, or the the smallest supply of water, the scarcest supply of water in the US, and we all know that at some point something's got to give. And so I would say that this is not probably a 3 to 5 year issue, but in some cases, some of the Midwest states might be better situated, depending on how they handle their water resources, to be able to support more population than they do now. Then kind of more broadly with climate change, we know that climate change will eventually, it already has begun, but it will even continue more so to change migration patterns globally and within the US. In part, if I didn't depress you before, in part because the coasts are shrinking and so much of our population is along the coast, so as we have the water level rise, people will be displaced. It's hard to say whether they're gonna pick up and move in to the Midwest. It's probably more likely that they'll move in a little bit inward, but who knows what happens when there are major climate disasters that people get tired of dealing with. So I guess my take on the climate thing is there's a lot going on there. It has a lot of potential to disrupt the patterns that we already have in place and have been in place for many decades, but who knows exactly what the outcome will be or when that will happen. That's my best guess.
So can you go back to the slide about the unemployment rate and the open jobs?
Yeah.
So I'm an economist, but not a labor economist, so
Okay,
full
okay.
disclosure. But one of the things I know that typically happens when job vacancies exceeds unemployment is technological innovation.
Oh, yeah.
And technological innovation adoption.
Yeah.
So often those innovations have been around a while, but either
Yeah.
unions or other constraints have prevented
Yeah.
companies from adopting them, and suddenly they find themselves in a situation that they need to do that. So is there any evidence about that particular possibility for the Midwest in particular?
Yeah. I think that's a great point to bring up, and I didn't address it directly. So certainly technological innovation is going to play a role here. Currently, employers that can make the switch to use technologies have or will, but there's a lot of cost associated with it. And so I think for a lot of, say, manufacturers, they don't know if really this is the right time to make this huge investment. After they've seen some of my numbers, they'll say, yes, no, is the time to make this big investment. The other thing I would say is just in terms of kind of the shorter term job openings is we currently have the technology to do a lot of the stuff that people are doing, but we're not fully to the point where machines, not quite to the point where machine, and you know this, but I would just say that that's my take on it, is that there will be technological solutions, but there'll be a lag before they can truly be put in place. Some of them will be really expensive. I don't know, if you want to add anything to it, please feel free, but that's kind of my take on that.
Did you have a question? Oh, yeah. When you indicated that the unemployment is low, is that because people are actually working remote and not going to the office as they were before? Because, retail people have suffered as a result. They don't sell suits and a combination. Is that part of it? Or is it we just don't have the people available because of decline in birth rates?
My belief, coming from a demographic perspective, is that we don't have the people because of declining birth rates and because it's happening at the same time that we're having all these retirements. So the baby boomers are retiring, they're opening up jobs, and what we call replacement jobs are being filled by people who are maybe already in the workplace. And so we've got kind of all at the same time, kind of opening up of jobs across the board due to all these retirements, and also kind of not being filled at the younger end of the age spectrum or the kind of career trajectory because we don't have the same number of people entering. So it's a combination, I believe, of those two things. That doesn't say anything about the skills match, whether people are in the right place, whether they're not taking or whether they're taking or choosing to stay out of the labor force because the right job isn't there for the skills. There's all kinds of things that are much more complicated that are true. But my take on this as a demographer is just that big picture. The people are no longer growing at the rate that the number of people are no longer growing at the rate that they were in the past. We took that to be normal, and that's already begun to change now, and it's changing kind of the pull of work relative to,
Well, may I follow up on that? If
Yeah.
that is the case,
yeah.
what should we be doing, whether it's in the legislative or the businesses world, what should they be doing to alleviate this problem?
So I think personally, and I want to hear from everyone, I'll give you my short answer, and I want to hear what you all have to say too. I think that this picture means that we need to prioritize higher order skills and education, because those are the jobs that we won't be able to replace as quickly, and those are the jobs that will pay for families to be able to cover basic living expenses and then some. And so I think that in this scenario, we just have to start thinking about all jobs not being equal and prioritizing the jobs that are those higher order jobs, and also the jobs that care for people, for the elderly, for young people. Those are the other ones that we have to raise up and say, as a society, we're going to do this and this. You know, that's my read. What do you all think? Yeah. Yeah, please.
Well,
You have a comment?
the tricky part of that is in higher education, a lot of times we get pressured to not educate those people because the incomes are not there. And the cost of higher education becomes harder to justify for jobs that are clearly in demand but don't pay well. Now, it's
Yeah.
not our job to decide the
Yeah.
pay raises, but we do get pressure
Yeah.
a lot of time to say you should stop those programs. And it's a follow-up question of, well, then what happens to that group of people?
Yeah.
And it's a tough one in my mind.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me like it's a policy question, right? It's a public policy question.
Sorry. Okay. Just to follow up on that, to get outside the higher ed, silo here just for a second,
Yeah.
I think we need to think about incentivizing work a little bit more. I think it's hard for students to imagine going to school when they've been told, you cannot afford a house. Childcare is unattainable. You're going to go into probably some kind of substantial medical debt before, a certain age, and those kinds of things. So again, I think there's some work to be done on the employment side where, corporations need to pony up and make these jobs worth going to and going to school for, and that people can see they have a pathway forward. I mean, school is great, but when you top out at a certain wage, I mean, what's the point?
Right.
And I can see where our young people might be feeling that kind of desperation. And when you couple that with the emotional stress they have been through, not only with the pandemic, I mean, they're kind of in an existential crisis, right? Because they've questioned their mortality due to the pandemic. And we've been teaching these kids something that I never learned, but they have been practicing how to survive gun violence since they were 5 years old. I mean, their whole entire lives, they have been taught at any moment this could end. So I think we need to think about that piece too. Why would they look 30, 40 years in the future when we've been telling them from day one, keep your fingers crossed?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think, there are some really big existential issues that go beyond higher ed that we need to be thinking about, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that.
That's
I-
deep.
Can I just
I'm going to
say-
give this personally to Larry. Larry,
Can I
this
just
better be
add
a
about-
damn good question.
Thank you very much from Michigan. So the former president at SDSU, who came from Illinois and came back to South Dakota, just sent me this article. I mean, timing's unreal. It's not just the Midwest, it's worldwide. Japan will lose 20 million people by 2050. That's 45 times more
than what they lost in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Switzerland, who was the greatest, they're not generating enough kids. Italy, not generating enough kids. So it's worldwide. And when you look at the universities, graduate students coming from foreign countries, that's not where we're going to find them. So it's not just the Midwest. But I loved
I
your
agree.
presentation,
I
Dr.
agree.
Brower.
I
So
agree.
my question is,
Yeah.
the other thing that you haven't talked about is the age that the new generation is getting married. Used to be 20, 18, now it's what?
I don't know the average age, but I mean, I think it's in non-marriage too is increased, and these are all kind of tied into the lower birth rate, and maybe even into the existential crisis that you were talking about too, with the continued birth rates going forward.
Oh, no, I just had a comment or question.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a little less optimistic on the graduation rates because I think many states, including ours, changed the criteria once we were getting beat up in the legislature of what, and we got an automatic, I think, 3% bump or whatever it was at the time because we just changed the definition, which isn't really heartwarming. So going into your definition there on your unemployment, are those people that are voluntary or involuntary unemployed? Because that, is really played into it, because some people are, the baby boomers, who incidentally hid underneath our chairs because of nuclear practice, but, what's, and we're just sometimes just saying, I'm going to be unemployed and I don't care. I'm not going to look for a job.
So this particular definition is people who are actively looking for work. But we also know at the same time that there have been people since before, since after the Great Recession and since before the pandemic, as more and more job vacancies have opened up, that it's pulled people in so that the unemployment rate, the true unemployment rate, if that's something that can be known, is really as low as it possibly can be. We don't have a lot of people on the sidelines who are discouraged, who would otherwise be going in, but there may be plenty of people who would be working if what they could earn would compensate them for the cost of their labor if they've got kids or whatever it is. So I'd say for this particular definition, it's actively people who are looking for work, but the situation has become such that it's tight all around. If they're in or out of the workforce, there's just not a whole lot of people on the bench. And I looked to the economist to see if I got a nod in agreement. Oh, not a labor economist though. Did I misunderstand?
No, I was just, has the definition changed?
Oh, over time? These are all active, oh, I see what you're saying. I'm sorry, all the same, actively looking on the unemployment rolls. I'm sorry, yeah. Yeah, these are people who have filed unemployment with their state, so, yep.
Is this on? Oh. I just wanted to address the fact that if we want an educated future, then I think state legislatures need to make sure they're supporting higher education the way they used to. We have a young 24-year-old legislator who quoted how much the state supported in Iowa, supported our region's universities 24 years ago. We're supporting them $2 million less now than we did 24 years ago. So that cost is being absorbed by families, and there are kids that can't afford it. They can't afford to go to school, and they would be in the workforce working those jobs that we need them to do if the state would support them more.
Yeah, I think
I
that's
guess
the
it's
case
not a
in a lot
question,
of
sorry.
states. No, I think that's the case in a lot of states, and I think it goes back to what you were saying too, that employers are starting to ask the question, where do I fit in here? And they're starting, I've seen them personally, starting to believe that they have some role to play more so. And so I guess that probably has policy implications as well.
Last word.
Thank you. I would agree with that comment, because when I started in the legislature, we were funding 49.5%. Today, we're funding 23 point. So that says that. I know this sounds really strange, but how does homeless play into this? Because we haven't talked about it, but in many ways, it is part of it, and that's what my constituents have talked a lot about.
Well, in terms of the numbers, I'm not sure that I can say, we've got a survey here that estimates the number of homeless, but I will say kind of generally, under these conditions where you've got a really tight labor market, not a lot of growth expected, and a lot of demand, we don't have the option to let anyone's potential go unfilled. So that's what I can say about homeless and many other groups, you know, that for whatever reason, there's been barriers to full potential. I don't know if that's what you were getting at or not, but that's kind of how I see it fitting into this picture.
Thank you,
Yes.
Dr. Brower. Thank you. You know, one of the things those of you that know me or know me a little or know me well, I am a big supporter of being transparent and making sure things get out on the table, because you can't address problems unless you know what your data is, right? And I'd love to know, what do you guys talk about? Like when you're in the room with all the other demographers from the Midwest, or like, what do you say? Like, what's that like? But I do, you know, most of us in this room, I expect, chose to live in the Midwest. Whether we grew up here or we ended up here because we married somebody who was from the Midwest, we chose to live here. And when you think about why that is, I think those are the things that are going to help us solve some of these problems, right? I also kind of sarcastically always say to myself, we have water and the rest of them don't. But I really do feel like there's something about the culture, you know, and the connections that are in the Midwest that will help us figure out ways in which to solve the challenges that you've outlined for us, Dr. Brower. So thank you. Let's give a round of applause for Dr. Brower, and thank you to Katie and the folks that helped get this together, Mary and Katie, and we'll see you tomorrow morning.